Thanks everyone for joining today. Really appreciate you taking the time to spend the next 60 minutes with us. So the focus of today's conversation is going to be 2021 predictions and a review of 2020. We'll be taking a look at the incidents, technologies, and regulatory directives that really helped to shape 2020. We'll talk about whether or not those actually came true over the last 12 months and what our thoughts on these moving forward. We'll talk to our expert panelists around their predictions for what they expect to see over the course of the next 12 months, and then we'll dive a little bit about our next steps, how to prepare, what everyone on the phone needs to start thinking about with regards to implementing this with their businesses. I'm Emily Bertrand. I am the Director of Product Marketing here at Intelligo Act Zero. I'll be helping to lead the conversation today. We also have some other folks on the phone, which I will introduce in just a minute. Just quick agenda, how we're going to spend the next 60 minutes. I'll quickly introduce our three panelists. We'll do a review of 2020, talk about whether or not our predictions actually came to pass, some things for us to consider as we look forward. Then we'll dive into a panel discussion. The folks on the phone have come up with 6 different predictions for what they expect to see in 2021. And audience questions. We've carved out some time at the end. Feel free to dive in right into the chat, leave your questions, and we'll get to those at the end. So our speakers, first up, we have Adam Mansour. He is the head of sales engineering and virtual CISO here at Intelligo Act Zero. He is the creator of Intelligo MDR platform, a certified ethical hacker. Some of the key perspectives he's going to bring to the conversation are his overall industry knowledge as a cybersecurity expert, compliance advisor, and he's a small business advocate. There are some additional webinars that Adam has spoken on in the last couple of months available on Bright Talk. We'll also call this out at the end, but on the resources tab, you'll be able to find this and some other helpful resources as well. And then we have Jennifer Mitchell. She heads up our operations here at Act Zero Intelligo. With over 10 years in IT services, she currently runs our SOC and leads our threat hunting team. She's passionately driven to operational efficiency. That's one of her big goals and targets here at the company. She developed Intelligo DR strategy. Some of the key perspectives she'll bring to the conversation are around threat hunting, the day-to-day life in SOC, and how she sees this evolving and changing in the future, as well as risk mitigation. And last but not least, we've got Rob Kanaki. He's a senior advisor here at Act Zero Intelligo, a senior fellow for Cyber Policy Council on Foreign Relations, a non-resident fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, as well as an accomplished author with 2 published books, The Fifth Domain and Cyber War, The Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It. Some of the key perspectives he'll bring to the conversation are, again, just overall cybersecurity industry knowledge. He's well-versed in policy and compliance, as well as international relations. And just quick housekeeping here. As I mentioned earlier, we definitely want to hear from you as the conversation goes. We've carved out some time at the end, so feel free to pop in your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end. So starting up, looking back at 2020, I mean, it has been a crazy year. None of us anticipated, at the end of 2019 when we were laying out our predictions, what would happen. But let's just cover quickly what we expected to see and whether or not this actually came to pass. So we laid out 4 predictions we thought were going to impact the cybersecurity industry and how this would impact SMB and mid-market companies and industries. Let's start with the first 2, rampant malicious email and technology augmented social engineering. We've got a hit and a miss here. I'm going to hand it over to Jen. She's going to talk a little bit about how this did and did not come to pass over the last 12 months.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So a hit and a miss here, but something that we've seen very clearly, across the SOC and across, the industry in general. Everybody, I think, has seen the rise of those emails hitting your inbox, especially the rise where it comes to COVID-related emails. The interesting thing about it is that we've not necessarily advanced our protection or defense against it to the point that we've been able to adequately start shutting down phishing attacks and the repercussions of some of those. And as such, the miss with some of the technology augmented is really simply that threat actors haven't needed to go that extra mile to get the outcomes that they want, because people are still clicking on those emails and our defenses are not necessarily at the point where we're preventing it anymore. So apart from those increase of some of the robocalls you've seen, we really just haven't seen a rise in some of these other methods, simply because they aren't really needed. What do you think about this, Rob? I think you've got a bit more context here.
The second prediction, you hear me?
We can.
Okay. In terms of the prediction here, the technology prediction's right. The technology capability is there, for instance, to capture your voice off of a webinar like this, to take it, to reprocess it, to turn it into a phone call coming from you as the CEO of your company to your CFO saying, hey, we got to wire $10,000 now. We've got to get this or we're going to lose this capability that we need. That can happen today. The technology is there. What's not there is the need to do that, because spear phishing still works. Until spear phishing works, none of these advanced adversaries are going to go down this alternate technology pathway. And so until we can really solve this first problem of initial access through spear phishing, we're not going to see these more advanced technologies employed, at least not against the middle market.
Interesting. So let's talk about the next two. Let's just get up the slides here. So the next two are the spread of privacy regulations and enforcement of privacy regulations. We've got another hit here and a miss, but we do think there's still more to come around this. Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about these two predictions, specifically in the Canadian landscape? And then maybe, Rob, you can talk a little bit more about how this you've seen this come to light and not come to light in the US?
Absolutely. I think I spent a lot of time talking about this particular subject on the other Bright Talks, but definitely, happy to dig into it more. The miss was really that in 2020, we would have a regulation that enforces dollars, right? Fines with respect to privacy or some sort of, amalgam of the privacy regulations, province to province, and one federal that would actually have teeth, as we like to say here. I think that there's been a very good, change in that. What's right in the House now for its second reading is Bill C-11, that if that gets turned into law, has actual financial repercussions, right? This means a lot to Canadian privacy commissioners, because when you look at, some of the examples like the Cambridge Analytica thing and not being able to enforce, fines on companies that abuse our personal information, these privacy offices have their hands tied. They have no enforcement. So I think that the enforcement, the miss, is going to come in 2021. But I think more broadly, what you're seeing is wide-scale adoption, right? I think the EU led the way with their general data protection regulation, and we're starting to see, almost copycat-like regulations showing up everywhere. And it finally made it to Canada. There is going to be fines, and we're likely going to see that next year.
So yeah, let me add in here. Just the point on GDPR I would make is that what we've seen is that GDPR really has become a global regulation. It's come out of Europe, but it's affecting most businesses doing anything online, and that's most businesses in 2020, even more so than in 2019. So if you're online today, you're probably at least making minimal attempts to comply with GDPR, whether you know it or not, because your web browsing, web hosting company, your email service provider, every online tool that you're using has said, okay, we're just going to adopt and meet the requirements of GDPR on your behalf. And that's a trend that I think has essentially put us in a position in the United States where we're lagging behind the rest of the world. And I think there's some chance, I'll add another prediction here, I think there's some chance that in 2021, in the United States, we take steps to essentially adopt or formally recognize GDPR nationally. I think if we get national privacy regulations in the United States, they're going to be to bring US privacy regulation up and online with European privacy regulation.
Interesting. Anything else to add from the group before we move into 2021 predictions? All right, let's get to the good stuff then. So 2021 predictions. Here's a little teaser of what the team here predicts is going to happen in the next 12 months. Privacy laws will change again. Hackers will leverage new extortion tactics. The traditional SOC is dead, a pretty bold statement that Jen's going to start. Jen will elaborate on in a couple minutes. Businesses will be less tolerant of alert fatigue and false positives. I'm sure this is something that everyone on the phone is concerned about today, has been before, and will continue to be in the future. But we'll talk about how we're approaching that at Zero Intelligo, and some things for you guys to consider as we look forward. The United States will add a national cybersecurity director, and the Biden administration will rein in cryptocurrency. So a broad variety of topics here. We're going to really hand it over to the three experts on the line to get going. So first up, Adam, I understand your prediction was around how privacy laws will change. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, I think, it's a doubling down. You can't let it go from 2020, so you bring it into your 2021. Just accept the loss. You didn't get it perfectly right. But if we look at 2021, it's certainly going to have implications financially for people that abuse PII. I think one of the interesting things about the regulation is that they're quite detailed in terms of the rights of the user, and their subject access requests and things that allow the end user to be in control of who gets to use their information, and a lot more transparency is going to be enforced. And if you don't get transparency, there's a dollar figure attached, right? So you can't just be this KG organization, stockpiling information and not being forthright with people. But what that also means is that IT is going to have a new burden, right? It always comes back to IT having these complex regulations that they then have to sift through to find out what are the controls, what do I have to change, what do I have to implement, how do I put the right pieces in place to satisfy this regulation. How do I not leave myself liable to something just because I'm unprepared, right? I think most people, if you think about castles or some other regulation that had financial penalty, they paid a lot of attention when money was involved. And I don't think people are by and large going to be trying to do dubious things. I think that they want to do these things. It's just hard to dissect and implement IT controls, because IT people frankly say, okay, well, what do you need me to build? How do you need me to build it? What are the requirements? And those things aren't in those privacy regulations. So I think that the adoption of something here obviously is going to expand and enforce, like we talked about. But I think that there is going to be kind of a broader sense that businesses, especially cross-border and throughout their incorporation, are going to have to think about what are privacy laws kind of on the whole going to affect them, and become part of their sort of half legal, half IT department.
Interesting. Cross-border, you mentioned cross-border. Maybe Rob, can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is really this division between Europe and the United States growing on a whole host of IT-related issues and privacy-related issues. I think, in fact, that really stems back from the Snowden disclosures during the Obama administration. And so Europe has had the skeptical eye toward U.S. technology companies, and concerns about U.S. intelligence community and U.S. privacy laws, concerns about the dominance of the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Facebooks of the world. They want their own national giants. And then they also, if they can't have that, they want to figure out how A, their citizen data is protected at those companies, and B, how they can access their citizen data when they see fit if a crime has been committed. And they recognize the US has different rules for that. And so this has been a sort of frustrating conversation where many people have predicted, we're essentially going to see the internet split apart over these issues, and we'll have a connected but separate Chinese internet, a connected but separate European internet, and a connected but separate US internet. And then the rest of the world will choose sides between the three of those. The question is, over the next year, will the Biden administration be able to create some kind of rapprochement with Europe, which is signaling interest in that? And will we have some kind of transatlantic accord that will cover these issues and we'll find common ground on privacy, where, as I mentioned earlier, we may decide in the US, hey, we're going to make a bold grand gesture here and adopt GDPR as our national standard and bring it into alignment with European law. It may take something like that in order for US technology companies to be able to operate in Europe in the way that they have over the last 2 decades. And so for that reason, there may be a lot of pressure to come to some agreement that can get Europe happy with US companies holding their data.
Interesting. And I know there's been a focus on this and the impact for larger size companies. But the folks on the phone are SMB and mid-market companies. And obviously this still does in fact have implications for them. Does someone want to speak a little bit around the impact to that group of industries, companies?
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, small business has always been challenged with, meeting the same stringent requirements of cybersecurity. Privacy is no different, right? You end up with, these massive fines, 3% of revenue up to $25 million. A small to medium business in Canada does not have, and even all throughout the United States, does not have the kind of bank account to be able to deal with that sort of liability, right? So they're hyper focused on this kind of stuff, and at the same time, they don't have the resources internally to interpret and act on wide sweeping privacy regulation and 90 controls in GDPR or similar in CPPA, which is what the nickname for Bill C11 is going to be, at least interim. So I think that they can't afford to get it wrong. When you look at the penalties, especially how the privacy offices in the ICO in Europe went after large corporations and distributed fines, the lion's share of the greater offenders were large companies, right? They could afford in Facebook to pay the billions of dollars in fines. They could afford it, without a significant disruption to their business. Similarly, you have, British Airways and other people, Marriott hotels, paying these massive fines as part of GDPR. If you implement the same thing in Canada, I think those same organizations are likely going to be the first to face fines. But small businesses like Aggregate IQ, as part of the Victoria company, BC company, as part of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they're a small business as well, right? And so, if they could have potentially have been wiped out by a ruling that said you owe 17 million pounds, which is what they tried to do before this regulation was in practice. So if you're an analytics firm, you've got data, you're a marketing firm, this is going to be pretty serious business for you to pay attention to this. And so I think that the implications are potentially business ending. I'm not going to over exaggerate it. These are huge problems that you could face liable for if you're not prepared.
And what about Act Zero Intelligo? How are we thinking about this as a business? Obviously taking care of our customers as it pertains to this.
I'll continue with small business and mid-market, right? If you're at Act Zero Intelligo and you're looking at, how do we help the customer base? I think the first is that in order to know that you're breached, most people think about, citizen data and transparency and the right to access, and a person sending you an email saying, yeah, you violated my rights and I'm going to lodge a complaint. And that's certainly a huge part of it. But the other part is that you have a system breach, right? You get ransomware, a Trojan, some attacker in your environment, you have to disclose as well. Right. And so, we're the alarm system for that. We always have been. That's what MDR's team is. Jen's team, finding these guys and making sure they stop them is part of, notification, is part of keeping you aware that you've had unauthorized access to this information. And so, obviously that's been, table stakes for MDR. But on top of that, we've also got, our CISOs laser focused on shortcuts, right? How do we help you understand how to notify, right? In the US, there's 50 privacy offices, right? You have to tell in different ways. You have to send mail in North Dakota. You know what I mean? Like, these are very different things that you may not understand. And you may have individual citizens from each state that have different requirements for breach notification if their information was accessed, right? That's not a small thing to just decide to invest in building in your practice on the day you get breached, right? So we try to arm people with these shortcuts and give them away. Watch the last few privacy webinars, download those sheets. Those are things we're trying to do to help people and not be smarmy about it, not say, oh yeah, we got a sheet, but you have to pay exorbitant amount of money to get it. We're trying to give as much information and deconstruct this as simply as we can, so people can know what they have to implement and protect themselves.
Interesting. Now, and speaking about breaches, your next prediction has to do with new extortion tactics. Lots of people have talked about tactics that threat actors use, but we've talked about this before as a group, that you want to focus less on tech and more on the social aspects of extortion. Talk to the group about this. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I can't say too much about this. I think, my friend Jen could probably come up here and save me on this question. There certainly has been a rise in a different type of extortion tactic, I think, where people would sort of, hold you accountable for the breach in general. But examples, Jen, maybe you could chime in and let me know what you think.
The tales from the sock.
Yeah, so we've actually seen kind of an evolution of some of the tactics that threat actors are taking. If you take ransomware for as one of the most well-known attacks that people are aware of, traditionally we would be able to give some very clear advice to people, right? We would be able to say, here's the best way to protect yourself from ransomware. Keep backups of your data, segregate it from your network, so that if you get attacked, you don't pay, you just rebuild your network and you put your data back in. Done. Now, obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that in practice. It's a lot more stressful, but it seems like a pretty solid approach. However, we've seen a rise, and you think of the so-called maze attacks and that recently, where the threat actors are saying, okay, we've encrypted your network and we have, you don't have access to your data, pay us. And by the way, if you don't pay us, we have taken copies of all of your sensitive data and we will publish it online for everybody to see. And that has been an evolution of the attacks that make it a lot more difficult to protect against. And the one of the main ways that people get into these is phishing attacks. It is social engineering. It is people clicking on emails, right? So being able to lock that down at the source with security awareness training for your employees and all of that kind of stuff is really kind of your best defense against those kind of attacks. Because nowadays, if you're getting hit by ransomware, it's not just, do I have my data backed up? It's, they have my data and they're going to put it online for everybody to see.
Yeah, and let me just add to that. I think what we're also seeing is, okay, we're going to do this typical doxing where we'll release all your data online for everybody to see, or alternatively, we're going to auction it off on the dark web. And we're going to show just a couple examples of what we've stolen, and we're going to describe what else we have: bank account access, personal records, embarrassing details, things like that, that other actors may be able to monetize through their own extortion scheme or their own financial fraud. And so there's any number of ways that these actors are finding to monetize what they've stolen, even if you won't pay the ransom. Yeah. The other thing I would add here is the privacy aspect of this has become really, really interesting, because the assumption when ransomware began was, as Jen said, they've locked up your stuff. It's actually secure. Not even you can access it. Now the guidance coming out from state attorney generals is, if you have a ransomware attack, you should assume that before your data was locked up, it was accessed and taken off your network by the adversary, and you now need to notify. And that notification may say, we don't have any evidence that this information has been or will be released publicly. However, we've lost control of it. And that's not a very pleasant thing to tell your customers or your subscribers, that you lost their information and it's in the hands of some criminal actor that wants to monetize it.
Yeah, it's always really surprising to me to hear how quickly the speed at which these tactics are changing and evolving. At Zero, that's what we do here. We want to make sure that we're stopping these. Adam, you want to talk a little bit about how we're doing that, how folks on the phone can start thinking about this, just given the speed and rate at which things are evolving every day, every hour on this?
I just have to be able to click the unmute button, I think. Certainly for folks on the phone, they have a couple different approaches, right? There's probably a number of you that are sitting there thinking about your vendors. We didn't really talk about them, but you have people that are connected to you to provide software services, networked to owning some of your data as a subservice organization, hosting companies, and now you have to be watchful of them, right? So there's the idea of due diligence, vendor management, understanding who's a trustworthy vendor, and making sure they're part of the ecosystem of letting they've had a problem, because you're not the only one that has to tell your customers they've had a breach. If you're going to be a customer, be a customer, right? Make sure that they're doing that. Second, people think, well, how am I going to afford this if something happens, right? If something does go wrong, where am I going to go, right? And there's something to be said for, MDR to say, let's sound the alarm for you. Let's walk you through the process. Let's make sure we can inform you as to what was accessed and how, et cetera, with some level of sophistication behind it that you probably wouldn't want to afford to do yourself in-house. Then there's also this other aspect of insurance, right? This after it happens, science behind you're going to have a toll taken on the organization that, just like a car accident, it exists for a reason. We have to assume that this is part of the rules of the road nowadays, that there will be some sort of investigation or spike in labor or time, energy that's going to go into dealing with one of these things. And insurance is a great way to prepare for that eventuality as well. So I think that it's one of those three, if not those three, that will help you keep a good eye on where you're at with this. Obviously, looking at the regulation and understanding the implications is one thing. I mean, it's very easy for us to just give you the shortcut: 3% of revenue, or $25 million in Canada, 17 million pounds in the EU, and then throughout the US, it's 2,500 to 7,500 a record. There you go. You've got your business case. Now what, right? Like, you don't really have to think too deeply about adhering to the regulation. You know that it's going to be a problem for you. Like Rob says, if you get ransomware, you're going to have to assume you've been, your data's been lost. Now what are you doing with your vendors to make sure you understand? Now what are you doing with your providers and your software to make sure that you can articulate? And now what are you making sure that you do from an insurance perspective to cover the costs, right?
Interesting, yeah. Well, on the topic of evolving tactics, that kind of leads us right into our next prediction around the defense side of things. Jen has a pretty bold assumption for 2021 that the traditional SOC is dead. Let's try to prove us wrong here.
Yeah, and I do believe this. I think that the concept of the traditional SOC is dying off, and I think in 2021 we will see it increasingly change. So, I mean, first, let's talk about what we think the traditional SOC is, right, or what we see the traditional SOC to be. So, typically, if you were to picture it in your head, you're imagining like this, NASA style room. You've got these big screens up across like all one wall, maybe all walls, right, if you're really going for it. And you've got people like all just lined up in cubicles together, like watching these screens and like inundated with all of this information. You also see things like you've got these tiers, these levels, right? At some point, I think trying to apply things like ITIL principles and stuff to security happen. So you've got these tiers, and you've got tier 1, tier 2, and you see these incidents and stuff like starting to be passed up through these levels. The reason that they're seemingly required is because you've got a lot of really skilled cyber people within these kind of low-level tiers doing essentially low-level work, right? Most of what people are dealing with is alerts and notifications, and they're just churning through all of these false positives every day and making sure that everything is okay. As a consequence, you also see low morale. You see revolving doors, right? There's a skills shortage in the industry. You see a lot of like really, really great cyber people who are just like churning through companies because the companies are putting them in these low-level jobs, and they're, you're just basically dealing with alerts all day. And it's not a great environment. So two things happened, right, in the last year, which one we saw coming and one we didn't, which I think has killed the traditional SOC. What we saw coming was the rise of automation, machine learning, and AI. And what this is doing is it's actually making, it's giving us the capability to have more intelligent output. And it's automating away the need for these lower tiered roles. Because instead of a person just sitting down, just going through thousands of alerts every day, we're able to assign machine learning to that and AI to that, so that it happens automatically. So what you're left with is this need for being able to properly use, your people where their skills are best placed into more interesting investigations, into unknown threats, into research, into managing incidents. Whereas before, largely most of their time was spent on known threats, right? Which is really something at this point we should be able to automate away. The other thing that we didn't see coming, of course, was the pandemic and COVID-19 and the push to remote work. And all of a sudden, everybody's SOC gets disbanded. You know, I am currently running a SOC from this beautiful location. And what we've seen is that the SOC performs better. So the wall of screens was for show. Everybody sat in a room together, was maybe even hindering people's ability to work. Cybersecurity can be really complex. It requires a lot of deep work. And you don't do that in a room with 50 other analysts and all of this activity and all the bells and whistles coming at you. And so we've actually seen the SOC improve. We've actually seen improvement of performance. We've seen improvement of efficiency. We've seen morale go up because work-life balance is better. They're getting to work from home. They're getting to spend more time outside of it. And when you couple that with the machine learning, that means that most of these known threats and alerts coming in can be taken care of with like automatic detection and response. All of a sudden, you don't need so many people on 24/7 shifts. You can, you know, when the alerts come in, they're real. So someone gets woken up, they deal with it. And you start treating people better. And it gives us the opportunity to hire people who are in places where they're happy, they're able to have families, we can hire more diverse candidates. And when you get and put all of that together, you get to a point where you have distributed, highly skilled cybersecurity people working on real problems, working on the things that they should, not overloaded at their peak capacity in terms of their brain and intelligence and everything else that they're doing, really solving the right problems and protecting the customers. And that is the way to go. Companies no longer investing in these NASA-style environments, like multi-million-dollar rooms that, as it turns out, serve no purpose. And they should be investing in their people. They should be investing in training. They should be investing in the machine learning part of it and passing down those savings to their customers. And so I think the traditional SOC is dead. And I think ultimately both the analysts, both the engineers and the customers will benefit from it.
Interesting. And I'm sure a lot of the folks on the phone, can attest to how quickly they were forced to adapt to that new reality. I think, March 13th, like basically overnight, right? But we've been pretty successful at it here at Zero Intelligo. I joined the company in August, and I've never had an easier or more seamless onboarding process, even just that, right? Why do you think Zero Intelligo was uniquely positioned to really adapt that quickly, specific to the SOC or just overall?
Yeah, a few different reasons. But the main one being is that we were already working on this before we had to work on this. So both from like a people perspective, you talked about your onboarding experience. We have a lot of work and effort that goes into really valuing our people, right? That's just something that we do. But separately, when it comes to actually the SOC itself and the operations, and you think about disaster recovery plans, Adam will remember a few years ago us going into a room trying to say, okay, well, this is what a SOC looks like, and here's all the things that we want to do over the next few years, and trying to create this new amazing thing, and realizing that those two things fundamentally clashed. And we came out of that room being like, all right, SOC out the window. That's not how it's going to work for us. So by the time we got to the pandemic stage, we were already investing heavily in machine learning. We've got an amazing R&D department doing that. And we were already rolling those kind of, the results from that out into our SOC. We were already heavily focused on each of our individual people doing the best work that they could do. And we were already had a fully fleshed out DR plan to make sure that if anything could happen, we were able to just pick ourselves up in any location and continue the work. So the answer is, on one hand, you could say we got lucky, but on the other hand, we've been working on this for a long time already because we kind of saw it going that way. Of course, we didn't see the pandemic coming, but the problems that we wanted to work on turned to be the ones that benefited us when the pandemic hit.
Interesting. Two follow-up questions here. So one, you mentioned the role that AI and machine learning has played in helping us to make that transition a little bit more seamless. Any of the team on the phone, how can customers start thinking about this differently? How are we thinking about it at Zero Intelligo that maybe could be helpful for them?
Sure. I think that, there's a quote from a sales engineer working on the driverless car. And he was saying, eventually you have to take your hand off the wheel because you're gonna ruin the algorithm that makes it cause less accidents if you keep fiddling with it. And I think that there are some things that enable the threat hunter really effectively through machine learning and AI. Some things that are automated, and it's out of necessity. We say we get lucky. I think what Jen says, we get lucky. We may have been working on different problems, but this is how you solve them, right? At the time, it would have been, customers in different time zones, or it would have been a hyperscale problem where we had literally customers onboarding 50 firewalls in one day, and it would just be this gigantic spike in data. And it's not like we could just go to a resource pool of people and say, well, we'll just add 5 more people in this scarce resource time to get a perfected analyst to sit on this to adapt to that, right? So there are things that you have to do in data management, things you have to do for hyperscale that AI and ML play a really big part of to build the efficiency into the threat hunting and the real-time alerting process that has to happen for you not to miss something, right? There's also even the science of, we learn new things every day. You talked about tactics and techniques changing all the time. Well, when we discover something new, which is constantly learning, constantly evolving, we may have to go back and look at a few days, maybe even weeks of data to see, has this actually happened to us previously? That's not something that's really easy if you're just getting emails and alerts on stuff. So the technical design behind the AI and ML necessity, not just for scale, but to do things that I think humans and analysts would want to do in their SOCs. They cannot do it as a function of time or the software that they've been awarded. And we do have a question. I think it's a great question, maybe salient to this, which is, we're all moving to cloud environments, right? Are there, inherent vulnerabilities or something new and scary about the cloud that we should be concerned about? And if you were born in the cloud, right? If you were a cloud provider, you're already publicly facing your servers and your infrastructure, right? So you're taking it head on. You may have been playing part-time if you had a data center with like email or a web server. You had like a little tiny piece of your organization facing the internet. You maybe had your toe dipped into this pond where everything was hostile all the time. And cloud providers have been dealing with this hostility constantly. If you look at team members, our head of engineering, Jerry, or Ed from product, they came from Microsoft and Amazon, and they're the cloud providers that honestly had to rethink the entire process. Because if you just put a Windows or Linux box up there and you're doing the same thing you were doing in your data center, it's going to be tragic results, right? You're just never going to be able to maintain it, especially at the volume that these people were doing. So serverless architectures, right? The APIs and the designs around multi-factor authentication, the hosting infrastructure, the resilience, the 11 nines reliability that these providers have put in, just to make it safe enough to be cloud at all, right? Internet facing, let alone to be able to have your data and your systems in it. So, we talked for a while, in the 2020 predictions about, what is the state of, attack if they figure out their way under the covers into the hypervisor. And the providers have thought long and hard about compartmentalization and redundancy in areas where these kinds of things won't have such a widespread impact that people would imagine this giant single bubble has, and it's not like that. It's highly decoupled, not contiguous, et cetera, et cetera. The networking isn't even there, right? So there's all kinds of things that preclude the cloud from having the same problems we've had in vulnerabilities in our data centers or in our operating systems like our workstations. But certainly you do have to think of what you're being sold. And right now, I feel like we're aggressively telling people in the cybersecurity community, focus on zero trust, right? Just take your workstation out of the user's hands, take your identity and validate it with these policies that say, it's definitely, Jen coming in on Jen's laptop and you'll be all right, right? And they forget that authorization and and getting access to something because you're a trusted person doesn't mean that the state of your machine or your application at that time is not compromised, right? And so, you know, while everybody's saying zero trust, I think the community imagines that what they're saying is we're not going to trust anything. Everything that's happening is going to be validated, right? And they assume that security and inspection of that software is part of it. And it's not. We're talking about trusting the identity, trusting the access, not trusting the transactions, not focusing on, you know, the malware and the ransomware and the Trojans that are plaguing the businesses. So I feel like a move to cloud doesn't preclude you from getting phished, doesn't preclude you from having your invoices impersonated, doesn't preclude you from getting, you know, ransomware. That's still your problem. It just so happens that your access over VPN is also lousy. Your collaboration software in your, you know, Cisco voice video WebEx room is lousy, right? You need to do literally what we're doing right now, right? You need cloud first enabled software to do these things. And that means that your architecture changes, right? But so too does your mindset on how you're going to protect your servers and your workstations, but not all the way. You have to keep the parts for detecting and responding on the endpoint or the application that you were doing in the data center and on the workstations to make that happen. I'm gonna pause here because I feel like, you know, there's a whole other webinar on zero trust.
Yeah. Well, keep your eyes out, folks, on the phone. We've got our next topic. Coming back, Jen, to your second prediction. I'm sure everyone on the phone here is really familiar with alert fatigue, whether or not in the traditional SOC or not. What's your prediction around this? How are folks handling this? How are we handling it at Intelligo X Zero?
Yeah, I mean, and this is a very short one. I think cybersecurity has become so much more accessible to people, and what we've seen is a rise in customers of cybersecurity, which is almost everybody, being a lot more educated, right? And as a consequence, a lot more discerning in the questions they're asking their vendors, and they should continue to be, because companies have the capability and should be investing in machine learning and AI. And what that does is that they have the ability to be able to reduce this concept of, hey, if you are buying a security tool, you are going to get thousands of alerts and notifications, and you just have to accept that. And you either have to hire all the people to deal with it, or you have to hire us and we'll deal with it for you, right? And that's kind of the message of what a lot of cybersecurity has been up to this point. Machine learning and AI means that we are going to be able to reduce this notion of thousands of alerts, 95% of them being false positive, of course, down to just the true positive ones. And that's where companies should be investing. So, you know, the educated customer, the discerning customer that, you know, thankfully we're seeing a really great rise in lately, you know, needs to start asking these questions of their vendors. What are they investing in? What does the day-to-day look like? Am I just going to get a bunch of alerts I don't need to action? Is that all you're doing every day, looking at alerts that you don't need to action? And just making sure that, you know, whoever that they're, you know, taking on as a partner or as a supplier is doing the right things, right? Alert fatigue is real, right? And it actually can almost, you know, cause some events to happen because you're not paying attention anymore. And we can see that going away. And there are a lot of companies, including ours, that are driving that way. And I think that you're just going to see the rise of customers who are no longer going to be as accepting of the norm of, hey, if you buy this tool, if it's, you know, be it AV, be it SIM, whatever, it's just basically log aggregator, you're going to get a bunch of notifications, and that's just something that you have to accept. I think people are no longer going to put up with that. Yeah,
that's great. Really insightful. I just wanted to make a quick note, guys. If you do have questions, continue to pop them in. I've seen a couple come through. We'll definitely make sure that we get through the last two predictions so that we can get onto those questions. So actually switching gears a little bit here, I'm going to hand it over to Rob. I mentioned earlier about his rich history with government and cybersecurity policy. Obviously well poised to speak to some predictions around the makeup of our President-elect's cybersecurity team. And I also understand that this is actually happening in real time here. So Rob, why don't you talk to us a little bit around the United States getting a national cyber director?
Yeah, so I think this is pretty close to a done deal as we can get at this point. There was something called the Cyber Solarium in the US. It was a multi-year effort to really look at a strategic level at cybersecurity in the United States. and to make recommendations to Congress on legislative changes. And they made a lot of recommendations and have managed to get many of those recommendations into a piece of must-pass legislation, the National Defense Appropriations Act. So this is a 1,700-page bill that appropriates billions upon billions of dollars to the Department of Defense. And they've attached to it a series of requirements, including one, the creation of this National Cyber Director position. And so this is going to be a fairly major change. It's not yet on the president's desk. There's some chance the president may veto it, but I'm fairly confident it's going to happen. And so when the Biden administration comes in, they're going to be confronted with a very different federal organization for cybersecurity than the Obama team left with in 2016, 2017. You're going to have CISA, the newly empowered Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, headed by Chris Krebs, that played this critical role in defending the 2020 election. And then you're going to have this new cybersecurity director position that's going to be a White House office and a Senate-confirmed cabinet-level position responsible for all cybersecurity, responsible for tying cybersecurity together across the federal departments and agencies. Senator Angus King from Maine, when asked why he thought this was necessary, given that there was CISA and there was Cyber Command and there was the NSA and there were all these federal agencies that were responsible, he said, we've got really, really great silos. We have cylinders of excellence. What we need is this agency that's going to bring them all together. And so that's what the NCD will do.
Interesting. What about the impacts for everyone on the phone here? What does this mean for SMB mid-market companies?
So I think what you're going to see a couple things. One, you're likely to see expansion of regulation, and that being driven by the NCD to look at critical infrastructure, which can include small businesses, and to say, okay, who's responsible for making sure that these companies are protecting the cybersecurity of the United States? And where there are gaps or weaknesses in existing regulation, proposing new ones. So I think we're likely to see a push on that front. The other piece, I think, is the question of what happens on a really bad day in cyberspace. How would a small business or a medium-sized business or a large enterprise that's getting attacked by the Russians, by the Chinese, by the Iranians to cause some sort of national consequence, how do they communicate and how do they get help from the federal government to include Cyber Command taking some action on a network overseas? These are the kind of thorny questions that have been really hard for the federal interagency to deal with, absent a strong national cyber director who not only can mandate policy, but can also actually create some of that connective tissue. So those are the two areas I think that may affect the small businesses.
Interesting. And just in the essence of time, let's get on to the last one, which, I mean, as we've talked about this in the past, I found the topic of cryptocurrency both confusing and also very interesting. What do you think is going to happen, once the Biden administration moves in to the White House in January? How's this going to impact Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and how it relates, obviously, to everyone on the phone here?
Yeah, I've been watching Bitcoin climb and really wondering what's behind that. I think we're many years into Bitcoin and we haven't found any legitimate real use for it. I think what we're seeing in the Trump administration is a pretty skeptical eye towards cryptocurrencies and multiple efforts to look at how do you use money laundering statutes to ratchet down cryptocurrency as a medium for exchanging the profits, particularly of illegal cyber actions that we've been talking about today, ransomware. And so I think we're going to continue to see pressure on that front. I think that we're already seeing the long predicted emergence of terrorists using cryptocurrency to fund operations and to make money. And that's going to be something that will lead to a crackdown on cryptocurrency. And then the final prediction is if you look at the environmental impact from electricity use of cryptocurrencies, and their generation and maintenance, it's huge. It's overwhelming. And so I think from that perspective, everything the Biden administration is going to do is going to go through this lens of how does it fight global warming? How does it fight climate change? And when you look at something like Bitcoin, you say, well, this doesn't actually serve any good or positive purpose in the world, and it has this huge negative impact. I think that may be the argument that finally tips in favor of some kind of very strong regulation to reduce cryptocurrency and its impact on cybercrime and on other issues.
Interesting. What about, quickly before we move over to some questions from the audience, what does this mean for ransom payments? Could the regulation of this change, the ransom strategy, make it a little less viable?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've been actively pushing for, so I don't know if I can call it a prediction. But I mean, I think the idea that paying ransom should be illegal is something that is starting to gain more and more traction, because every time a victim of cybercrime pays a ransom, a lot of that money goes to Lamborghinis and leather jackets in Kiev and Moscow, but a lot of that money gets reinvested. And so we've seen this growth of ransomware from something that was hitting your grandma's old computer to something that is now taking down entire enterprises. And that growth has been funded and fueled by those ransom payments. And so you really got to think twice about, is it morally okay to hand money over to criminals to get your data back, because it has this larger impact on society. And I think we're going to start seeing regulators in the US and elsewhere say, hey, you know what, actually, you can't pay their ransom payment. You cannot give this money to these cyber criminals because it has this larger order of effect. Interesting.
Yeah, I definitely know a lot more about cryptocurrency now than I did when we first started prepping for this. It's very interesting. I found the environmental aspect of that wildly interesting and never something I've considered. But I mean, if it helps to push to get this more regulated, illegal, I think we've got a good case there. All right, guys, we have 7 minutes left. We have a couple questions from the audience. We'll try to get through them before the end of the hour, or 12:30. If not, we can extend this by 5 minutes. Folks on the phone, if you do have to leave, you can access the recording on Bright Talk afterwards. But let's jump right into it. All right. So first question. So in fact, the stock is not dead. It transforms, is what somebody has said. We've invested heavily in stock. Do you feel that will be wasted in the future, or if it's going to be able to adapt with the times? Should we be looking to diversify our certifications, considering it takes significant effort, and we are not 100% sure what different certifications might be most important to you for our customers? We've been looking at so many, CSA, STAR, etc. Jen, sounds like you.
Yeah, so to the first statement, that is definitely a less aggressive way of stating our prediction. So, our prediction being that the traditional SOC is dead, right? So the SOC as we know it is dead, not the SOC itself. It definitely, the transformative aspect is there, and that is true for sure. To the next question. So, really, I think when we're looking at investments into the SOC, there's multiple avenues. It sounds like if you're investing heavily in your people, that is definitely the way to go. Putting aside, of course, we assume in terms of like detections and tools and stuff that they're using, just enabling them to be able to use all of those tools remotely really is the way forward. In terms of the certifications itself, actually, Adam has a lot of experience directly in the cert space, so I'm going to that one over to him. But really, I think it's just, to me, it's the advice of like, invest heavily in the people, make sure they've got space to be curious and to train and to investigate and to do research, and you can't go wrong there. Adam?
Yeah, I'll be brief about the certifications, and it comes back to the way, if put yourself in your customer's shoes, you're doing vendor due diligence, right? You're trying to understand what practices, processes, technology have the customer invested in. Are they repeating that exercise? Has it been validated by a third party? Now, when you look at this problem and say, okay, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to build because I'm not sure who's going to buy, it may show a little bit with that, the maturity of the market you're pursuing isn't very well known to you. And in those cases, I would say pick a certification, maybe something like a SOC 2 Type 2, that can reflect the software that you're offering or the service that you're offering, to give the customer some assurance that you built something custom, but it's been validated by a third party. When it comes to the other certifications, depending on the country, depending on the vertical, depending on the size or the type of information you're talking about, should I go get FedRAMP certified tomorrow? Have I got a ISO 27001 use case? Do I have a PCI AOC requirement for retail, right? This really depends on who your customer base is. I'm not a business consultant nor a legal one, but I will say that your performance of contract usually belongs to your customer's requirements that they themselves are under. So if you're looking at retail as a customer, you're probably looking at PCI AOC because they're under that, and to give you the subservice organization job of being their SOC, if you're a SOC outsourcer, you're going to need that. If you're in-house, you're inside the company, and you're looking at certifications, again, you got to wonder in that company who your customers are. In which case, if you're big enough in a company to already have a SOC, somebody from the legal, the CIO, the CTO, somebody should have told you what certifications they need for the customer, right? And if they haven't, I'd say seek it from leadership, because if that kind of stuff doesn't come up from up top, then I would say spend your budget dollars somewhere else.
The other thing I would just say on that is, also look outside of the certifications. There's a lot of training bodies that offer like really up-to-date practical training, like in practical labs, so that your people are actually able to exercise their skills and learn new things in a practical environment. I know Rob has some experience with some of those companies, if you've got anything to say, but don't just restrict it to the certifications. Certifications are great and they're incredibly useful, but there are other training avenues out there that will actually keep their skills incredibly sharp. Rob?
Yeah, I don't want to plug any other companies on here, but I mean, I think the idea that many certifications, they're kind of antiquated, right? They're going to ask you to answer multiple choice questions and to get the lexicon right in a field, and so a lot of people will go have that experience of saying, okay, I've been operating in this field for 20 years. I've always called something this. This certification wants to call it that, and I've just got to memorize it and be done with it. And I'm a reluctant holder of a multi-acronym certification. On the other side of it, you have these online training platforms, which aren't really saying, don't show me what you know, show me what you can do. And if you can't do it, you're going to figure it out in the way that most people in this field have learned their skills, right? They're going to spend time Googling. And so it's a more structured way to sort of teach yourself cybersecurity far more rapidly than you can do it on your own. But it's not about memorizing facts and memorizing the names of things. It's, if you're going to learn to analyze malware, you're going to analyze malware, not name the tools that you could use to do that.
Yeah.
Well, and another question for Rob, actually. The prediction around cryptocurrency suggested regulation around paying ransom. Is this something companies are actually doing? Are they paying? And I'll actually add on an additional question to that, maybe for the rest of the panel here, is what else can folks do when they get into that situation?
Yeah, I mean, so companies are paying. Even some large companies are paying, and some very large companies are planning for ransom incidents by making sure they know how to get hold of large amounts of Bitcoin or are already holding large amounts of Bitcoin for the purpose of paying ransom. So it is happening. We're seeing this weird phenomenon where a lot of ransomware operators are better at seizing your network, penetrating your network, than they are at remembering how they did it and being able to undo it should you pay the ransom. And so a lot of the time, companies will pay ransoms and then the decryption keys don't work and they never get their data back, and they also never get their money back because they're dealing with criminals. We're also seeing on the other side of it some criminal groups responding to that by saying, hey, we will send you references from past victims who will tell you that, in fact, when they paid ransom, we gave the decryption keys back and they worked and they got back their data. That is a very strange world that we're living in. The key here, I think, is that you really need a multi-layered defense, and you need to be hunting within your network and stopping these large multi-stage ransom attacks before they lock up your network. because it's really, really hard to get your data back once it's been locked. And if the only way to do that is to paying a ransom, I and others think you probably shouldn't try to do that.
I'll add on one more thing, which is, if you've ever dealt with these cases, it's easy to imagine a Word document. You zipped it, you put a password on it, you can't get access to it. So unzip it with the password, you get your document back. But they're indiscriminately applying encryption to every part of the operating system with application servers, right? With databases and web apps and, these synchronous things, like if people's phone systems are getting encrypted. Even if they hand you the key back, you've destroyed the application. The synchronous nature of it, the syncing with files and databases, the indexes, the permissions on the files, like just doing that to a system is going to ruin it, right? So there's not always a way back from that, right? Other than restoring. So, plan for it. Imagine if you flip the power off. Do what Amazon does, right? Google Chaos Monkey. It's hilarious. They shut down whole parts of their data center at different times to make sure they're resilient to this kind of stuff, right? Do the same, right? Like I know that having a SOC and preventing and detecting this stuff is important because, resilience isn't everything. You can put it back up and then knock it back down. And that's a cat and mouse game you don't want to be playing with labor and time. But the idea is that you should also expect that you can't get it back because there is many cases where even if you have the key, it's not going to work to fix the app.
Interesting. All right, we've got time. One last question. Jen, this is for you. When you talk about low-level SOC activities, can I automate these for my company on my own?
That depends, is the honest answer to that. It depends on some of the activities. It depends on how you're approaching them. Automation and machine learning is a rabbit hole that we definitely don't have time to get into right now. What I will say that you can do it by yourself. It takes a lot of investment. It takes time as well. So you have to weigh up the balance of, do I have both the money and the people and the time to do this myself? Or has somebody else already done it? And therefore the ROI of employing them to either help you do it or do it for you would be much better for your business. It's like anything else. Imagine trying to create Facebook from scratch. Yes, you can. Will you get to the reach and the developments and all the features they have today, good or otherwise? Probably not. And it's kind of the same approach you have to think going forward. Like, do you need to reinvent the wheel on something? But I would start at the simplest things. Start at the simplest things, work your way up, see what you could do yourself in the time. Once you hit that wall, though, you might have to start looking outside.
Interesting. All right. I want to thank the panelists. Thanks, guys. Very insightful. I appreciate you guys taking the time to talk through. We'll reconnect in 12 months to see what comes to light here. For everyone on the phone, thank you guys as well for attending. We'd really appreciate it if you could rate and provide any feedback for the webinar. We want to make sure we're providing you with the most valuable content so you guys keep coming back and learning more along with myself. We mentioned a couple of additional resources available that some of the panelists spoke to. You can download these on the resources tab right here in Bright Talk. And I will give you back less than 4 minutes. So thanks again, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.